Eats house, and we've got baseball being played and the Stanley Cup playoffs around the corner and the NBA playoffs, and Lord knows we're going to be running races and golf courses and Masters and all that good stuff. But I was up late watching HBO last week, and I saw an amazing story, one that still plays in my mind. And if you've listened to the show, you've known I've talked about every time I see bright lights and lots of collegiate athletes, I'm wondering, who's making the money? Because I know they're not. She is a longtime journalist. She does some of the best work that I see on television at Vice and HBO. We're thrilled to have her on the backside of an NCAA Pay For piece that you should definitely check out if you have HBO, or you can steal the internet somewhere. You can follow her journey out on Twitter at Gianna Toboni. That's 2 N's in Gianna, and it's Toboni. I think I'm pronouncing it properly. She joins us from New York, but she's been hanging out in Somalia, like in the middle of war zones and stuff lately. But we're going to talk some toy department right now and trying to fix collegiate athletes and athletics here in America. We welcome Gianna Toboni on for her maiden voyage here at WNST. What's going on? Thanks for waking up, getting up, and not being jet lagged and hanging out with us a little bit. I know when these pieces hit television, they're months in the can, but welcome back from Africa, Gianna.
Thank you so much, Nestor. Good to be here.
Well, tell me about the genesis of this piece, because I know you've been in fields interviewing ISIS fighters. I don't know whether the little press thing on the flat jacket matters all that much in the middle of these war zones, and obviously on the backside of the Syria travesty this week. You ran around and did basketball and football and the NCAA and money. It took you a year to put that piece together. I saw your hairstyles change, and I saw the months and the weather change, but that was a hell of a job in 30 minutes. Kind of tough to wrap that up in 30 minutes, Gianna.
It's definitely tough to wrap up in 30 minutes. I mean, sports is not something we typically cover. In fact, this is the first sports story we've done. And I think the reason we covered it is because it's about a lot more than sports. A lot of people see this as exploitation. They see it as an economic story. And I found it fascinating. As you said, we took more than a year to cover this story. And because it's heavily covered, it was challenging for us to do something different. That's what we sought to do. And so we got what I consider to be some pretty good access to a couple colleges, coaches, athletic directors, players. And then we did sort of a deep dive into 2 player stories, which were fascinating. These are great guys. And, I think there's this perception among critics who say, oh, these guys are entitled. They want these salaries. They're not thankful for the educational opportunities they have. And I didn't feel that way, actually. In talking to them, I thought that they were very humble. I thought that, they had smart arguments, and, they didn't want that much. They just wanted they and their families to have, a little bit more of a comfortable life.
Well, they're making money for people, right? I mean, that at the end of it, if you watch Monday night, and this has been going on for probably a decade for me. I'm a pretty typical guy that's filled out a lot of bracket pools, and I've done sports on the radio for 25 years, but professionally for 32 years. I've interviewed these athletes. I've been down to College Park a million times, and the old building, and we all know how the new building gets built. Look, I was out at the NFL owners meetings last week where Oakland and the community there and the state says we're not gonna pay for it here. I mean, I know there's a money trail, and when you follow the money trail, you learn more. But you took a couple of kids and just went around. These weren't atypical. They're very typical, right? I mean, any kid that's playing basketball or football that's coming from a hardship or a tough circumstance, they are making money for their coach. They're making money for the television executives, the people that are everybody's in on it. The popcorn vendor last week down in Phoenix is making money, but the kids dribbling aren't. It's so acceptable to the fans that they just it must have been what slavery was like 200 years ago. It's just the way it is. It'll never change because I don't know that this thing's ever going to change. I mean, the NCAA has put up one hell of a wall here. And, I said to my wife on last Saturday before the Final Four, I said, what happens if these 40 kids just decide today they're not going to do it? What happens then? And I know there's been a lot of speculation about football teams not showing up for bowl games and whatnot. What would happen? Until that happens, they've got the bull by the horns for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. When I started looking into this story, that seems like an obvious solution to me. As soon as they protest, the money stops coming in, and I think change comes more rapidly. But as I said, these are good kids. I don't see them as kids who are that, I don't know, I'm sure a lot of people would consider that radical. But one of the things I think, and you just touched on it, that is hard for people to decipher is who is bringing in the money, right? The schools, the athletic directors would say, a player doesn't want to play, okay, fine, we can easily substitute him in. Someone like Sonny Vaccaro, who created that whole system of, putting the shoes on players, and, the brands will benefit and will, pay the consultancy fees. He says, without a doubt, the players are bringing in the money. There are no games without the players. So is it these few elite athletes? Are those the only ones that should be allowed to profit? I mean, if you look at the Kessler-Jenkins case, what they're talking about is just allow the schools to pay the players. The market will decide. We don't have to create an insanely intricate system. Just let the market decide, which makes sense. I mean, I think that model makes sense. Either way you cut it, though, it's incredibly complicated. I think it'll take years to get to a solution that people are happy with.
Gianna Toboni does all things for Vice and for HBO. She travels the world looking for good stories. She did a piece on the NCAA and Pay for Play. A couple things. First off, you mentioned Sonny Vaccaro. I've had Sonny on a billion times over the course of time, talking basketball, talking money, talking hoops, and all that stuff. He's a fascinating character, and I guess to go to him, you go to the beginning of all of this, where the universities allowed the coaches to sort of moonlight by taking cash from Nike. And, of course, we saw Phil Knight up on the stool cutting down nets 2 weeks ago with Oregon as well. That the beginning of this thing is rooted almost 50 years ago now, right? And where the ancillary money would come for these student athletes, as they like to say. And, in the 70s and 80s, things really started to swirl around bowl games and around what we know as the genesis of March Madness. And Sonny Vaccaro was the first guy in there to say, here, wear these shoes, coach. Wear these jerseys, coach. We'll pay you. You'll make money. But the kids will get some nice shoes, and they do get some nice shoes, don't they?
Yeah, they absolutely, and they get a lot of them, too.
That they can't sell or give away, right?
Right, exactly. They just sit in the closet collecting dust. Sonny Vaccaro is such a hilarious guy. I love him because he's sitting there and he goes, the model that I created is beautiful. There's nothing wrong with that.
If you're a capitalist.
But what he says is, I never meant for it just to be the coaches profiting. The players didn't walk lockstep with them, and that's where the problem is. And as you said, the sort of moonlighting fees is how it began. And truthfully, that's still happening. They have their salaries, but then they get to make this cut on the side through brands. And so why is that money just going to those coaches? Does that make sense? Should that money be reallocated in different areas? A lot of people would argue yes.
Well, Gianna, my wife and I got in a nice fist fight about it over the weekend because she was like, they're getting a free education. I'm like, they're being exploited. They're getting a free education. Look at how much money they're making. You can go back and forth with this, and I think that's the eternal argument because it's gone on this long, right? I mean, I don't know, though, are we any, in your mind, having talked to all of these people, do you really believe that 10 years from now that we'll be on the phone together and there'll be world peace and we'll be talking about players getting a stipend of some kind?
It's so tough to say. I think the system will be different, but it won't be because the NCAA is raising their hand and sitting down at the table. This is obviously something where a case or, a player lawyers are going to have to force their hand. I think it's really tough to say. I mean, I think your wife does make a good point. I mean, the education thing I don't think is something to be overlooked. I did a story on student debt and, we have over $1 trillion of student debt in our country. The big question is, though, are these athletes given an opportunity to take advantage of their education, right? They're given this free education. I don't think it's worth nothing. I don't think it's just a chair in a classroom. I do think that's valuable, but it's only valuable if they're given time to study these subjects, if they're being set up to have a career outside of basketball. Is that happening in much of the country? I don't know. I don't know that I'm convinced of that. If they were allowed to get an education, I think that would be a good argument.
Well, basketball, the one and done, that's not about an education. We all know that, and that's the way the system is played, these days on the basketball side for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gianna Toboni joining us here. You can follow her at Gianna Toboni out on Twitter as well as at Vice on HBO. She does great work. She's just back from Somalia working on other things. But, when you're out in a field in a war zone, and, I have incredible admiration for your courage for all the things that you've done. But, then there's the courage that guys like me have, slappy sports writers who I've had my press pass taken away by the Orioles 11 years ago for reporting the truth. We obviously have this unique man running our government who decides that who gets to sit in there and ask questions or not ask questions. I was amazed that Texas Tech allowed you in. I was amazed that Tom Izzo had you flying around on an airplane that looked like a pretty nice little Learjet that the Sparties fly around on in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And I watched you walk up and down a plane aisle asking questions. Why did they give you access? I mean, they don't want you and Vice and people like me around asking tough questions. And I think it's always really awkward when you're sitting there at the middle of the quarter on the 50-yard line with some athletic director who's answering to every booster, every sponsor, every donor, every chancellor, all of that. I found it fascinating that they wanted you around.
Listen, I give a lot of credit to Michigan State and to Texas Tech for letting us in, because it wasn't just interviews with the athletic directors. As you said, they let us see the facilities. They let us talk to the players. They let us on the private planes. They weren't nervous about giving us that access, or if they were, they didn't exactly show it. Our producer, Matt Horowitz, did an excellent job of very clearly outlining what our story was and that we only wanted to tell a thorough, fair and balanced story, which I think is what we achieved. We talked to the folks both at Michigan State and Texas Tech this week after the piece aired, and we were wondering what they thought, if they thought it was fair, and both of them came back and said, we thought this was fair. Thanks for doing the story justice. There are obviously some things that we would have wanted to be in there that weren't in there. We understand our time constraints, but overall, they felt it was good, and some of them even said it was the best best documentary that's been done on it. So I think that's the goal in these stories, when access is tough, it's being very clear about what you're trying to achieve, and then it's doing it. Because if you go in there and you screw these schools and these coaches and you tell them you're doing one thing and you do something else, you lose access in the future. No one trusts you. And I think as a whole, that's not just for our name, but as a whole, news and documentary companies have to be careful with that, because if you screw one school, you don't just screw it up for us in the future. You screw it up for all media companies, all news and doc companies. And who does that affect in the end? It affects the public. They no longer get to see those stories.
Well, what affects, what's screwing someone over and what's reporting the truth? Sometimes that's the same thing. I mean, I've been doing this a long time too. And, I see as a media member, I'll give you a good example. The NFL, they used to want publicity back in the day. Now we fly out to Arizona for the NFL owners meetings, and I swear to God, the media access room is right next to the boiler room. At the edge of the. If they moved us any further, we would be with the cactus, out in Arizona. That is where sports journalism is going, because there are plenty of people like me sniffing around, sort of unafraid to ask questions that they probably don't want to give the answers to.
Yeah, and we have to do that, right? We have to do that. I think it's the biggest thing is pitching a story that you then follow through with, and not pitching a sunny, happy, Pleasantville story and then doing a hit job. I think that's the main thing, which obviously you understand.
Well, you're a little bit like 60 Minutes. When you knock on the door, you're not there to bring flowers. I mean, that would be your reputation, right?
Yeah, it's letting them know both sides of the stories are going to be represented. You're not going to get off easy. We're going to ask you tough questions. And I think that's it. And I think that's what viewers want. They want exactly what you're saying, is for us to be pushing them and getting to the meat of the story.
Why was this important to do from a sports angle? I mean, I guess there's a million. Bob Lee chases this stuff around 3 days a week, right? And, the New York Times and journalists, and obviously with what's going on in our country politically, most of the attention is there. But there are, dozens and dozens of interesting sports stories. And, I know you at one point tackled campus sexual assault, which a lot of times, comes from the sports, the athletic side of things. Many times those are intertwined and intertangled, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but we had a web extra, and there was a clip of Jameis Winston, and someone put it into the cut, and I watched the cut, and I said, "Sorry guys, it's got to go," because I wasn't going to allow him an opportunity to talk about something positive. It could be seen as, in some ways glorifying him, and I wasn't into it. And when we did the sexual assault story, one of the cases that we looked at involved an athlete. It was a former Olympian, and the school didn't want to properly adjudicate the case because they make money off of that athlete. It's also, part of their public image. And I think, universities, and who said this? The economist that we talked to said this. He goes, if you want to, kind of walk into a place and be confused at every turn, just go to a university. And I think part of the reason is that their number one objective, of course, is to maintain their reputation, which they have to do for funding to continue to, get, the top tier of students and athletes and so on. However, when their main mission is to set, kids up to be adults, to move on, to pursue their career, I think, if they're going to be honest with themselves, they need to be looking out for those people. And in these cases, we requested interviews with more than 30 schools. Only 2 talked to us. With the sexual assault story, we reached out to dozens. I think it was more than 100 schools. Not one dean, not one president would talk to us about this issue. And to me, that is their job, is to talk about this issue. Their job is to protect their students. By not talking about this issue, by not addressing it face on, they're hiding in the corners. It's a cowardly thing to not come out and talk about these issues. In order to create change, if they're really committed to that, they should be talking about it. They shouldn't be afraid of it. They shouldn't be afraid of the hard questions. I think, there's a good comparison to be made with political scandals and sexual scandals. Come out and talk about it. That's the way that I think you gain the respect of the public and of your constituents or of your students. Not enough colleges, I don't think, are doing that. And that's partly why I really appreciated that Michigan State and Texas Tech, had the courage to talk to us.
She is Gianna Toboni. You can follow her out on Twitter. She's a correspondent and a producer for Vice on HBO. She does great work. Last thing, look, I can't bring you on without asking you this, especially in this political climate. How in the world did ISIS give you access to stand in the middle of a field in the Middle East and talk to them? And given your gender, given your passport, given why you were there, I stand in incredible admiration for your courage. But you've done some amazing things and gone to some amazing places and survived, quite frankly. I worry for you, Gianna. I like you.
Thanks, Nestor. Yeah, I mean, being, a non-Muslim American woman working in media is I'm sure exactly who ISIS wants to see right in front of them. So those situations can be a bit nerve-wracking. We embedded with the Peshmerga, the Kurdish military there in northern Iraq, and we went to the front lines with them. So ISIS territory is probably, you can see it. You can see the flag. It's probably, a 7-minute jog away. And so that's the front line. They're constantly, in firefights. We spoke to ISIS fighters who were being held captive by the military. So the military was holding them. They had captured them on the front line in weeks before. And so we sat down with 2 of them, had an hour interview with each of them. And, it's fascinating because we know this terrorist organization as what we see in the YouTube videos, and you sort of forget they are human beings, as hard as that may be to sometimes admit. And so when you sit down with them, you learn that, okay, some of them were forced into this. One of the guys we talked to, and one of them was just, evil at the core, but the other one we sat down with, his brother knocked on his door one day and said, "Let's go, you're joining us." And he said, "No way." And he said, "Okay, we'll come back and kill your 5 kids and your wife if you don't join us." There you go. He's in ISIS, now he's in prison. So, these are things we see with, organized crime around the world, but it's a perspective you don't often associate with ISIS fighters.
You do great work. I appreciate you taking some time, and I'm working on Somalia, but no more sports stories, right? You're gonna go back to the get out of the candy department, right?
I gotta say, I was smiling a lot more doing the sports stories than I do the terror stories. So I think I might be pursuing more sports.
All right, well, stay safe out there, and I think Vice in general, you guys do great work, and I always tell people if you want to know what's going on in the world and see the best journalism being done, to check you guys out. So I really appreciate your time, and hope to make your acquaintance somewhere where there's beer and sports where athletes are being paid for a living. I don't know, a Yankees game or something. We'll figure it out.
I love it. Thanks so much, Nestor.
Appreciate it. Gianna Toboni joining us here from HBO and from Vice, and you can follow her. That's GIANNA TOBONI out on Twitter and anywhere the internet and home box office is served. You can find me out in the Bayou Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from wherever you are. Our morning newspaper delivers to your email inbox at 7 a.m. That is brought to you by our friends at Planet Fitness. PlanetFitness.com. It's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. If there's any breaking news over the weekend, you'll get it first on the WNST text service. That's brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And, of course, Dennis will be here on Thursday, driving you home, getting you ready for the weekend from 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. I am Nestor. Nasty at WNST.net reaches me. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. Don't forget, we still have space left on our London trip, and we're doing Green Bay, Nashville, Minnesota, and wherever the Raiders decide to play. Yes, even Vegas. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.